Hello guys, today I'm going to talk about the Wheel of Time series. This is a 14-book epic fantasy series that I just finished about a month ago, and I'd just like to talk about it. This is going to be a spoiler-free sort of just overviews of the pros and cons of this series. So this epic fantasy series was written by Robert Jordan, who wrote the first 11 books before he sadly passed away, and the series was finished by Brandon Sanderson. The Eye of the World, the first book, was published in 1990, I believe, and it was sort of a tipping point between classic and modern fantasy, so you can see a lot of the trends that were sort of popularized and brought forward for modern fantasy in this series as it progresses. It starts off as sort of a little bit derivative in the first book, but it moves on from there because at the time, like 1990 and before, you really had to be like Tolkien to get published and be successful. So that what this series did is the first book was very derivative of Tolkien in a good way. It was well written and everything, but from there it moved on to do so many more interesting things that sort of helped the genre move forward as a whole. So first I'm going to talk about the cons of this series, the problems that a lot of people have with it. The first thing and the main thing really is that Jordan was extremely wordy and overly descriptive of a lot of things. You'll spend paragraphs and pages on seemingly unnecessary details, and you'll get a lot of sort of filler seeming content. And this is, I mean, it's obviously a 14-book series, but it only takes place over a span of 2 or 3 years, or I think something like that. So this series definitely could have been condensed quite a lot, and a lot of people have trouble dealing with his over descriptiveness. I personally like description quite a lot, because a lot of this description is related to world building, just little interesting aspects of like architecture and stuff like that, and I find that quite cool, but that's just because I'm a world building nerd. And another thing about this series is that the pacing is not that great at times. It starts off pretty well, but there's a chunk in the middle, which is known as the slog to a lot of fantasy fans, and I think it's considered books 8 through 10. And these books are a lot slower. There's not as much that happens. There's some sort of repetitive and ongoing plot lines that can get very annoying for a lot of people. I didn't have too much trouble with the slog. I can definitely see that it was there and that it was a thing, but I was still really enjoying the series, mostly because just the world is so cool and the characters, I would really become invested by that point. So if you're in the slog, or if you're thinking about like, oh man, I'm going to hate this slog so much, just know that it does get a lot better in the end, in Jordan's last book, book 11, and then Sanderson's segment of it. Another thing that sort of annoyed me at first in the beginning of the series was the characters, but for me, for the first couple books, a couple of the characters were annoying in a lot of ways. Just their ways of doing things were sort of repetitive, and their actions could become annoying at times. But this became really a non-issue for me. Even the characters that I started out not really liking became some of my favorite characters of all time. That's about all I have to say for the negatives of this series. Its pacing is not always great, it's overly descriptive quite a lot of the times, and some people can find the characters grating. Moving on to the pros, which is the larger section, because I really enjoyed this series. It's probably, must be, top 5 fantasy series for me at least. And the main thing that I really loved about this series was the world building. That's got to be the crowning achievement of this series for me. And I guess if you just have 14 books, you can just fit so much into it that this world just feels so real to me. And especially like culture in particular was something that Robert Jordan did really well. And the world just seems really big, and that might just be partially because we see so much of the world through different people's perspectives, or the same people just journeying around the whole world. But you see a lot of interesting places with their own unique, well-developed sort of cultures. And another thing for the world building is the history, which is extremely layered and deep, and you get sort of hints of it throughout from a specific character's perspective, and I found that sort of introduction to the history really interesting. Another thing that's great about the series is the magic systems. So there's sort of a mix between soft and hard systems in this book. So like more mystical, less developed systems and more defined rules that you sort of know what can happen and what cannot happen. And I found that sort of dynamic really cool. And of course, the series was taken over by Brandon Sanderson, who is known for his amazing magic systems, and he did a really great job picking up that specifically. But yeah, I found channeling as a whole and a couple other side things to be very interesting for this series. Robert Jordan's prose, I think, is something that his writing style is something that I feel like doesn't get enough praise, because obviously there's the over-descriptive aspect of it, which a lot of people don't like. But if you just look at the structure of the sentences and words and everything, it really can be quite beautiful. And sort of a smaller aspect of that is the fight scenes. I really found like there's some sword duels going on in this series, and just the way he wrote fight scenes was just really unique, and I found that really cool. The plot was also a huge part of why this series is so good. Again, probably just because it's 14 books, it gets points just for that. There's just so much that fits into 14 books. And the plot lines were really, there was so many of them, and they sort of converged really well in a lot of places, and I found that also really interesting. So the plot was up there as a really good sort of element. That's the word, yeah. And also, for the prose, the characters were really good. I know I said in my cons that some of them were annoying at first, but really by the end of the series, you just come to love them so much, because we have this sort of main cast that we stay with throughout the whole series, and of course some new side characters that are introduced throughout, which are also very well developed in a lot of cases. But just the main cast are definitely some of my favorite characters in all of fantasy at this point. And Rand in particular, our sort of main character, has one of my favorite character arcs ever. He's probably my top fantasy character of all time. And even if you don't like certain characters at first, or the opposite, I guess, if you like them a lot at first, there's 14 books, so there's a lot that can change throughout. So your opinions on characters are definitely one of the things that will change the most throughout the series, or at least it did for me. And another great thing about this series is that Brandon Sanderson is obviously one of the most famous sort of modern working fantasy authors, and this is a good sort of introduction to his work too, because this is where he got a lot of his fame, and well, he was famous before, but not on the level that he is now. And you can see the influence that Robert Jordan and the Wheel of Time had on him, and sort of the effect that writing 3 huge books in this world had on his later works too. And just overall, this series is massively impactful for the rest of the genre and sort of the paths it has come through. So this is definitely important to read if you want to sort of understand the genre and its progression. So overall, this is a great fantasy series. They're huge books. Well, this one is not especially giant, but some of them are over 1,000 pages. All of them, I think, are over 600. But you should definitely read it you should definitely give it a try is the thing, because it's just so important and it's just so epic. It's so grand of a scale that it's just really fun. And so the world building and the characters and the magic and just the grand scope of the plot lines all coming together is why you should read it if you're in for that. And if you really don't think you can deal with like over description and some bits of poorer pacing, then maybe at least put it off. I don't know. So yeah, I really enjoyed the series. Give it a try if you want, and that is all. Like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you feel like it, and goodbye.